thank you very much. Let me say thank you first to Trudy and Tralac for inviting me, to Paulina for talking too long, making it impossible for me to talk less. This expectations thing I'm really beginning to read as a conspiracy, designed to drive another nail into WTO's coffin. But anyway, we will do what we can. So I didn't invent this title. I think I know who did. I'm not sure what it was supposed to mean, but I've basically transformed it into a discussion of industrial policy, what the options are, what the policies are, what's likely to come out of it, what the risks are. There's quite a bit of material in these slides. I fear there may be too much, but we'll see how we go. And obviously, if you're dealing with an issue which is as complicated as this, there are going to be some simplifications, so you must bear with me over that. But I'm going to try to get to some sort of sense of the different types of supply chains we're talking about and how that matters in terms of what you might try to do. And probably at the end of the day, you'll say this raises as many questions as it answers, but let's see where we go. Obviously, the starting point is that our basic working assumption is that there's a role for government in getting diversification and development and growth. You know, that might sound like an obvious thing to say, but there are some people who think that there isn't a role for government. But the question is, what is that role, and how does it work? And so, broadly speaking, and this is just a very short list, there are some pretty significant policy risks. One is that there's not enough information. Governments may not, probably almost certainly will not know as much as markets. They can focus on the wrong things. They might misread information. And worse still, I think, and a very common phenomenon, is that they fail to anticipate the consequences of unconnected sequential actions, putatively all moving in the same direction, but having all sorts of interactions which might be quite destructive and certainly unintended. And then there's a question of political capture, too much support for too long. It's not only trade policy that matters. I'm going to be focusing on trade policy, but enough has been said that today about how important it is to think of other policies as well. In fact, increasingly in the WTO, Pascal Lamy, he's had us working on various aspects of supply chains for the last year and a half, is of the view that one of the things that's gone wrong with our negotiations is that we're trying to negotiate in silos where it doesn't matter anymore. You can't do these things in silos anymore. You've got to think of a new way of trying to address what's relevant. And I guess my bottom line is it's not okay to be uncompetitive indefinitely. If you're going to get support from the state in one form or another, if it stays that way and continues that way, there's never going to be a dynamic process of development and growth leading somewhere. Even getting to middle income status will be good going, and after that, who knows what. So I think the basic bottom line has to be, at what point do we say that we are at least moving in the direction of a competitive economy, and we're moving further and further in that direction. Okay, some dimensions of intervention in general. I wanted just to mention these as an introduction. You know, there are kind of two ways. One way of thinking about this is what we're trying to do is we're trying to get into a process of transformation. You can do this by enabling policies, enabling diversification, enabling development, removing constraints, leading on to structural transformation. Or you can think about it in another way. You say, look, I'm going to go straight for the transformation. I'm going to act directly with incentives and try to change relative prices in ways that will change that will create the transformation. It's not a coincidence that those two approaches, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but emphasis is important. And I would say that it's not at all a coincidence that the broad-based approach is the first one, and the narrow focus on particular activities or sectors is the second one, and that is at the heart of today's debate about industrial policy. And then I just put in a little note what kind of policies we're talking about. You're all very familiar with these policies. I thought it was worth just quickly reminding ourselves. When I was a student in the 70s, and this was the subject of my studies, it was a little different. It was a little more straightforward. And I just want to remind ourselves of some of the kind of policies that we were used to talk about. We used to talk about import substitution, export policy-driven industrialization. That's a slightly newer one, maybe. Outward-oriented industrialization, And then, of course, these days, supply chain-related industrial policy. What I'm going to spend the next few minutes on is how do those things differ? But let's just remind ourselves what happened with import substitution. This is I think it's good to remind ourselves. If you have a large economy, you can do something with it for some time, probably. In fact, I think there's evidence that that is true. If you're a small economy and you try to do it, it's going to be a policy cul-de-sac quite quickly. Basically, you'll use your trade instruments on the import side. You'll have a highly varied tariff, bringing in cheap inputs, making sure that what you were going to use those cheap inputs to produce was very well protected against competing imports, and you would try to build your industrial base in this fashion. Of course, if you could get economies of scale out of this and you could start to move and become competitive, maybe you could make it. But very often what happened is that you basically locked yourself in to a larger and larger albatross, which was the manufacturing sector, and very little chance of exporting. The whole idea that you could export on the back of this was found to be really pretty much wishful thinking for many, many countries. And so in its purest and its most persistent form, particularly in a small economy, this all had to be reversed in many parts of the world. So I think I'm not, there'll be people, we've had lots of debates about this, that people will say, yeah, well, India and Brazil were able to do much more with import substitution. Maybe, but look at the size of their markets. It's interesting that China hasn't done much by way of import substitution. Export policy-driven industrialization. Now, this was referred to a little bit earlier in the last session. The idea here is it's rather like import substitution, but because you have a natural resource, you can put export restrictions or export taxes on the natural resource, cheapen the domestic price of that resource, make it an input into your industrial development, and build that way. Now, neoclassical economics would tell you that this was more efficient because you weren't taxing consumers, but in a sense you were implicitly subsidizing producers. It's, as I said, I mean, it's really no different if you can't get into an export mode on this kind of thing, you're going to end up in the same position with an inefficient domestic manufacturing industry. It has a couple of other stings in its tail. If you happen to be large enough to be able to influence the terms of trade by doing this kind of thing, you will get grief from your trading partners. We have seen this recently with China in the disputes that have taken place over rare earths and other raw materials. And also, it may be completely frustrated and cut off at the pass if your major trading partners have escalating tariffs along processing chains. So it's not a great, I mean, it's an idea, but it's not, it has very similar kinds of challenges to import substitution. Output-oriented industrialization was kind of what we often used to think of as the Asian model. It is the export-led growth model. But there is an interesting element to this, apart from the fact that you've got to submit to the disciplines of world market prices. And this is what a number of countries in Asia did, they basically equalized cost structures for domestic and export sales. So they eliminated the export bias, but you could sell domestically if you were able to, you could export. And in that way, you try to use this kind of model to get your backward and forward linkages and to diversify your economy. So to make it more than just an outward-oriented export base. But it's quite a hard policy. It has many of the challenges that I would argue that supply chain industrial policy has today. You do have to pick winners, but if you're clear enough, if your governance structure is organized enough, it will make sure that if you make a mistake, you take the protection away. And this certainly happened. I mean, the whole story of Korean steel is an example of how the Koreans picked the wrong industry at the wrong time. They reversed the policy and then they went back into it later when they were better prepared for it. It does assume a range of prior conditions relating to infrastructure, skill levels, and governance. And I think that is a little what I want to say about the supply chain story, actually. This is a poor cousin. Export processing zones, a poor cousin of export-oriented industrialization. And it's basically you carve out these zones. You attract footloose industries, mostly with infrastructure subsidies, tax-free environment, inexpensive labor, and you make some, and in exchange you get some jobs, you get some additional economic activity in the economy, you get the appearance of an export structure with some manufacturers in it, but in fact it may not have very many spillovers into the domestic economy, and these industries may well be footloose. There are other issues with it as well. There is some literature on successful export processing zones, but rather few. Rather few. I mean, it's successful in the sense of getting the backward linkages. There's a Brazilian literature on that which is fairly convincing. But on the whole, I think these things just tend to fester. So, what about global value chains? I use global value chains and supply chains interchangeably these days, but some people object to that. I'm just going to use them interchangeably. The thing about this is what makes it different? Why is this any different? What have we discovered? What is really new? Well, I mean, this is all technology driven. First and foremost, it's technology driven. That's why these things have happened. And what it means is that you've got more degrees of freedom, but it's also more hazardous. You've got more degrees of freedom because you can insert yourself at any point on a chain. You don't have to produce a good, as Paulina was saying, you don't have to produce a good or service from beginning to end. And I say service advisedly because I have something to say about that too. It means they've got a lot of focus on intermediates in a fragmented production process. Imports and exports, there's a much more organic relationship between them. It's no longer imports are bad, exports are good. I mean, that kind of thinking becomes much weaker. The them and us kind of thinking becomes weaker too, gets diluted. There is a possibility of, and this is another feature of this, of a regional orientation, and I know that's being spoken about around here, but this is not as an enlarged market for import substitution. That will be going down the same road, maybe a little slower, but same road. But there are plenty of examples of, I mean, most supply chains actually are regional rather than global. So there are other things that have happened, and again, I think these are largely technology driven, is that, in a textbook, when I was at school, there was just one little bit, almost like a box about complementarity among markets. Most of the time we spend our time thinking about the conditions of a market here, demand and supply conditions, the revenue curve, the cost curve, and then another different type of market. But the whole point about markets is that they're very complementary and very interdependent. And this is even more accentuated on a supply chain. So you do something in one market and you're going to be affecting a whole lot of other markets too. Makes policy much more challenging. Makes it much easier to get it wrong. Makes it much easier to encounter unforeseen consequences of actions. But it's also a source of opportunity, because it makes what the business management community call modularization possibly. It's a kind of clustering of products. It's bundling, and you can get advantages doing that. You can get more value added. You can probably do some segmentation of the market. You can get some advantages. You can certainly there's certainly possibilities there. But the other thing, which is sort of on the other side of the equation, is that if you're on the upstream, somewhere high up on the supply chain, and you start messing around with something, each time the component that you messed around with crosses another frontier, it literally magnifies the effect, raises trade costs disproportionately every time it crosses a frontier. So that's another part of the sort of hazard story of getting policy wrong. Services are extraordinarily important, much more than I think most of us realize. One of the things we've been doing at the WTO is working with the OECD is to try to get a global input-output matrix to estimate world trade in value-added terms instead of in gross terms. One of the early results was that whilst we for years have been reporting services trade as less than 25% of world trade, merchandise plus services, when we started looking at the input-output matrix, global input-output matrix, it doubled. It's very nearly 50%. And I think that's quite interesting because we know how big services are in many domestic economies. It's not that they're not important in services. And the sorts of things that they do on supply chains, they act as the glue, they're standalone components, they're very much part of joint production and complementary production. They have another nice little twist to them that because of modern technology, ICT, you can get onto the supply chain remotely. And this is what countries like Kenya have been doing to some extent with call centers and back office functions and so on. You don't have to have too much infrastructure for that. You just need a decent telecommunication system. And then in some supply chains, it turns out that after-sales services are incredibly valuable and important. And if you can get a bit of that action, you're going to be doing extremely well. So General Electric, for example, they have their jet engines. They lease the jet engines once they've made them. Okay, I'm sure they make good money making the jet engines, but they make far more money servicing them for the next 30 years. So, I mean, I think we should be, there's a real deficit of knowledge, understanding, and research on services. And, you know, there are pretty good reasons why. It's really hard to do. We've been working with an Asian outfit trying to do this and getting firm-level data, but really, really granulated firm-level data. And you end up with a residual. You can allocate all the costs between the beginning and the end of the chain, and you've got this residual, and you don't know what to call it. And a lot of it, it turns out, is value that isn't necessarily even priced in the market and not even necessarily contractual. It's a complicated business. So I think we just need to do a lot more work on this to understand where the opportunities lie. And I think the services story for developing countries who want to get a piece of the action on supply chains should be looking very hard at services, as well as lots of other things. So how do we go about it? Well, we've got to decide what we want to call a supply chain. We're in a partial equilibrium world. We've got to decide, okay, we're calling this our supply chain. And we're calling these our first tier, second tier, third tier suppliers. If you went all the way down to the last tier, you'd have you'd have a take on a kind of general equilibrium story or an input-output matrix. But for the most part, we just have to say, here's where it begins, this is what happens along it, and here's where it ends. And so we define these in a rather arbitrary way for analytical purposes, but it's important to remember that, because that kind of arbitrary definition, and if we get too wound up or too obsessed with that, we may miss all sorts of other stories which are quite important in terms of what's actually going on. And that refers to the question of how many tiers you chase down, tiers of suppliers, that is. The other thing that I think is really important, and we haven't got time to go into this is a vast and complicated subject. Are you part of a fragmented chain which has just sliced up the production process, and your slice could go somewhere else quite easily, maybe, if it depends how much sunk cost there is, depends what kind of supply chain it is. But it's a slice. It's a fragmented story of fragmentation. That's the beginning and the end of it. When you really get to business, when you really get down to making progress here, you're going to be part of some kind of agglomerated structure. And so there's an emerging discussion of this, particularly in Asia, about how, and this is, in fact, this discussion takes place in the context of the middle income trap. Many Asian countries fear the middle income trap. And in terms of industrial policy and in terms of the industrial sector, they are talking about how do we get to the agglomeration stage. Because once you're in the agglomeration stage, there are all sorts of, it's not just internal economies of scale, there's all sorts of external economies of scale. The whole economic geography story, you get agglomeration. So I guess that's where you want to go eventually. Ownership is tremendously important. Who owns the chain? Who owns the lead firm? And who owns the suppliers of the lead firm? In many cases, it's the same firm. They'll just set up their own branches and their own subsidiaries in a different country. And I think that actually does. You have to ask different questions about how to be part of this supply chain in those sorts of circumstances. And if it's contract manufacturing, these days in international trade statistics, actually international statistics, production statistics too, contract manufacturing is defined as a service. So it doesn't matter what they're producing. Usually contract manufacturing stuff like shirts and trousers and things, they will be, actually no, it can be electronics too. They will be classified as services in the accounts, which is infuriating because you don't know what the hell you're talking about anymore. But those are some of the problems we have to deal with. So who owns the lead firm and who supplies the lead firm on its supply chain? Really important questions. I'm going to quickly do a typology here because I think it helps. This is a bit crude, and maybe you could argue with it, and you could say, well, you could certainly make it, you could certainly granulate it more. But the idea is that, broadly speaking, if we can work with these three types, we can begin to see what's going on. So a resource-driven GVC, it's basically you've got the raw material lying in the ground somewhere, or you've got agricultural land. So it's for food, it's for commodities. So the supply chain definitionally starts in your jurisdiction for that reason. Very often there's a lead firm involved in extraction or cultivation or whatever it is, not always, but often. And then the question is, how does local participation take hold? What do you do to get local participation? You know, for a lot of these, in a lot of countries, this ends up just being basically a story about labor and pretty basic services relating to exporting. So the big question is, what else could we do? We'll come back to that. If some of the market ends in your own jurisdiction, then of course it starts to look more interesting, because then you can get a lot of particularly of the services on the downstream services, and you start to get more added value from your participation in the chain, even if only a portion of it ends in your jurisdiction. The buyer demand-driven GVCs, apparel, maybe vehicle parts, electronics. The lead firm is often a major retail outlet or brand owner, and this lead firm doesn't own any of the facilities that are doing the production in different locations, and it's all done orchestrated by logistics operations, and there are multiple small and medium enterprises that supply the chain. So this is quite an interesting model. It's getting commoditized now. It's getting harder to do, but it tends to be mass consumption items, low margin, really, you know, it's a sort of thing, it's sort of pressures that create sort of some of the things that you read about in the newspaper about workers' conditions in places like Bangladesh. Generally geared to exports. Maybe you start to feed it into the domestic market. So, for example, Foxconn has been assembling all the iPads in the world, iPhones as well, I think, but pretty well all the iPads. And for a long time, there was no market in China for iPads. And so they had to, if you wanted to buy an iPad, you're Chinese, living in Shanghai, could afford several iPads. You wanted to buy one, it had to be something called U-turn trade. Those iPads had to be shipped to Hong Kong and re-imported into China. Much more expensive for the Chinese consumer than for the American consumer. But anyhow, those things are changing, and so you see the Chinese, for example, increasingly getting a share of the domestic market. It changes the configuration of supply chains quite dramatically for them. If that isn't the case, the scope for domestic value added seems to be quite limited, both upstream and downstream. And so there's a big debate about that. How do you? It seems that these chains are really basically driven by labor costs. You can probably do a little bit of fancy footwork, but Foxconn, for example, are developing proprietary technology as their way of getting out of this. But that's a whole new story and a whole new supply chain. But generally, I think it's probably fair to say that these are the sorts of supply chains that will continue to move. They're moving out of China now because wages have got too high. Some may be inland in China, but there's infrastructure challenges there, so they're going to places like Vietnam, Bangladesh. Maybe they start to come towards Africa, I don't know. But it's certainly, for China, it's definitely been a stage in the process for them. Was the sort of made in China story was all about assembly, essentially assembly, even if the gross trade statistics made it look as if it was about high-tech production and exports. The supply-driven chains, I would say, more as capital goods, almost always a larger multinational as the lead firm, producing capital-intensive goods, high-tech production, quite keen to avoid to protect proprietary information, proprietary knowledge, and so much more of a tendency to have their own operations in the supply chain rather than, well, you've got to, basically depends very much on the country. The country really has to there has to be confidence that the country can protect intellectual property, and then you'll be perhaps more willing to outsource to, rather than just to offshore. But this is probably where you get more of a more convincing story about the distinction between fragmentation and agglomeration. So let's just look a little bit about what you have to do if you want to do something about any of these supply chains. If you want to get onto the processing, to the resource-driven one, some scope may be for supplying ancillary services at the extraction or the harvest level, maybe processing the output, maybe a combination of imported and domestically produced inputs. I mean, there's lots of stories. I said this had to be a bit of an oversimplification. I mean, there are quite a lot of interesting stories. For example, let's take something like cassava. Cassava, there's supply chains in Nigeria and Thailand, for example, for cassava. I'm sure there are others. But cassava is a really strange thing because it's got tremendous potential for high-value uses in food and pharmaceuticals. But you can't use it unless you use it fresh. So the only way that they can export cassava is dried and maybe chipped. But if they could get the facilities there to actually develop these chemicals and things, it would be a very different game. But that's a sort of example. Now, what would that take? That's a whole other story, which I guess we're touching on as we go along. But what you'll need on the policy side, if you want to try to do this, is you've got to do the same thing that you would do in import substitution. You've got to have a tariff with high variance. If you want to get into exports, you've got to subsidize them, at least to begin with, directly or indirectly. You can use various instruments like entailing investment with domestic purchasing obligations, or getting export, demanding in exchange for concessions, export obligations. I mean, we're beginning to see, this is actually going on in Brazil right now. Brazil have a lead firm which does electronics. I can't remember the name of the firm now. And they've enticed Foxconn in. They're trying to integrate backwards by getting domestic production of the intermediates. And Foxconn is promising in exchange for these kinds of incentives to buy local. And the question is, will this take off? And if it won't, it seems to me that then it's going to be quite a costly experiment. And what will make it take off? We can talk a bit more about that. Processes on the sort of buyer demand-driven GVC, maybe some manufacturing, maybe some intermediates. You can get into the intermediate game. Probably some scope for downstream activity involving services, especially if there's a domestic market. But again, when you look at the policy interface, I did this in a way partly to say I don't really see much difference in the kind of broad picture policy story. It's what you're trying to do. In each case, you're going to be using a similar set of policies. I mean, they'll design them slightly differently, but you're at the same place in terms of the kinds of policy mix that you're trying to develop. And it's the same for on supply-driven change, it's a similar sort of thing. It really looks very, very similar, which I guess I could have done this with fewer than 3 slides. I'm sorry about that. But I just wanted to make the point that when you really look at the characteristics of each of these supply chains and you say, now, what am I going to do by way of industrial policy, which means directed, specific, pointed, deliberate policies aimed at particular sectors or products or firms, I'm going to be looking at very much a very similar policy mix. And to have these policy mixes really change so much. The stakes are much higher, the opportunities are greater, the services component is much more important. But you're doing essentially the same thing as we were talking about in the 70s, the 60s, but actually beginning in the 50s. So, nearly finished. I said half finished. Horizontal policies. I mean, this is the other side of the story. Now, there's obviously, in this whole debate, there are people who will say, we can make what I've just described work. We will make it work. We can make it work. A lot of governments are trying to make it work. But then there's this other side of the story, and this would be the sort of thing that you'd have a lot of people will be arguing, is, look, you really ought not to be trying to force the pace by guessing who to be nice to, because you'll end up being nice to them for too long and they won't come through for you and you will have just wasted resources and you will have pulled the economy down with you. Why don't you go for economy-wide policies? Think of this as enabling. Think of it as an activity for enablement. So you do connectivity. You make sure the business environment is friendly. A lot of this is, you can trace a lot of this in story in many Asian economies, by the way. Trade facilitation. You really got to make sure that financial access, I don't really know much about the financial sector, but it's amazing to see every one of these opinion surveys, perception surveys, these days puts finance really high on the list of problems for firms, SMEs particularly. Focus on innovation, yeah, stable macro policy, and you have to engage in multilateral cooperation as well. So these are essentially are enabling first and resource shifting later. It would be a fair comment that these are not mutually exclusive approaches, but it would seem to me that if you don't do this, you might as well forget about the other. And that's, I think, the mildest statement you can make about the relationship between these two types of approaches to diversification and to making the transformation happen. So, this is my last slide. What combination of policies yields the best results? Well, it's very much a question of how you intelligently mix the policies. Very much a question of where you see exports in the game. Do you think that exports matter or not? And if you do you accept that you're going to have to be competitive to do this without government assistance eventually? Otherwise, you're just going to be grinding your economy down. Or don't you think exports matter? I think it's pretty important to be explicit about that. The degree to which policies are horizontal, well, we just talked about that. Ability to adjust policies. It's really hard. In our political economies, it's very, very hard to adjust policies. You build in vested interests. And governments hate to say we were wrong. We're going to dismantle this. But if you don't have that ability, you should not go anywhere near, in my view, you should not go anywhere near trying tailor-made policies. You shouldn't even think about it. And the time frame, it's a similar issue. You've got to be able to say, you know, this isn't working, and you've had enough time. And in fact, you could even pre-announce the time. If you know enough about the market and what's reasonable to get a return on capital and expect to see them being competitive, you'd say, look, if you haven't done this by year X, we're going to take it away. And then, of course, this is all linked, isn't it? Adequate governance. Do you have a government that can do this? Do you have a government that's well enough informed? Do you have a government that's well enough focused? Do you have a government that is committed to this? And if none of those conditions are there, I think it's bad news. So no magic bullet and plenty of risks. A rather facile conclusion. Thank you very much.